I was cleared to fly again, while my papers said I had not finished flying at all. Each mission added weight to my logbook that no one seemed able to see. The orders kept coming, written far away, neat and unquestioned. I went up knowing the system would be corrected, just not in time for me. In the spring of 1943, the air war over Western Europe had entered a demanding phase. Allied planners, operating from offices in Britain and Washington, were accelerating daylight bombing operations against German industrial targets. The 8th Air Force, based across eastern England, was expanding rapidly, absorbing new crews and aircraft while adjusting doctrine under pressure from operational losses. Airfields that had once hosted a few squadrons were now crowded with heavy bombers, maintenance crews, clerks, and administrators, all working within a rigid system of orders, schedules, and forms. At RAF Bassingbourn, a concrete runway complex north of London, routine defined most days. Aircraft were inspected, engines were run up, flight logs were filled, and crews attended briefings that followed a predictable structure. Weather reports were posted. Mission boards were updated. Ground crews worked long hours to keep aircraft serviceable in damp English conditions. Within this environment, pilots were expected to operate according to standing procedures that left little room for deviation. Among the pilots assigned to the base was a captain in his late 20s, an experienced aviator by the standards of the time. He had completed flight training in the United States before being assigned overseas with a bomber group that had arrived in England during the previous winter. His background was unremarkable on paper. A civilian pilot license before enlistment, steady evaluations during training, no disciplinary marks. Like many others, he had transitioned from training aircraft to the 4-engine bomber with efficiency rather than enthusiasm. The aircraft was demanding, unforgiving of error, and dependent on coordination across a 10-man crew. By April, he had flown several operational sorties. These missions were logged carefully, each entry reviewed by operations officers and recorded in official tallies. The number of missions mattered. Tour limits were established and adjusted as losses mounted. A pilot's progress toward completion of a tour was tracked through forms that moved from squadron to group headquarters and onward to higher command. These records were intended to ensure fairness and consistency, but they also created friction between what was flown and what was recognized. The captain's daily routine reflected the structure around him. Mornings began early, often before dawn, whether or not a mission was scheduled. He reviewed aircraft status reports, spoke briefly with his crew, and attended briefings even when he was not on the flight roster. On stand-down days, he participated in training flights, instrument checks, or formation practice. When weather grounded operations, administrative work expanded to fill the time. Reports were completed, evaluations were updated. The administrative machinery of the Air Force did not pause simply because aircraft could not fly. It was during this period that the first signs of limitation emerged. A clerical discrepancy appeared in his flight records, initially minor in appearance. One mission flown under marginal weather conditions had been logged under a provisional status, pending confirmation from intelligence officers who were verifying bomb strike photographs. The confirmation was delayed. As a result, the mission was not immediately credited toward his total. The captain noticed the omission when reviewing his records, but was advised that it would be corrected in due course. Such delays were not unusual. The system relied on multiple layers of verification, each intended to prevent error. In practice, these layers often slowed recognition of completed work. Pilots were accustomed to waiting for records to catch up with reality. Most assumed the process would resolve itself without intervention. At the same time, operational demands were increasing. Loss rates during deep penetration raids were higher than anticipated. Replacement crews arrived, but experience was difficult to manufacture quickly. Commanders emphasized adherence to doctrine, believing that consistency offered the best chance of survival. Deviations, even well-intentioned, were discouraged. Within this framework, individual circumstances were subordinated to standardized rules. The captain continued to fly when assigned. On missions, he followed formation procedures precisely, maintaining position even when flak bursts disrupted visibility. He complied with recall orders when weather deteriorated and accepted aborted missions without protest. His conduct did not draw attention, positive or negative. In the context of the group, he was one of many. The administrative discrepancy, however, persisted. A second mission credit was delayed for similar reasons. This time, the delay extended longer than expected. The operations clerk explained that higher headquarters had issued revised guidance on what constituted a completed mission, particularly in cases where bomb release was uncertain. Until clarification arrived, several flights remained uncredited. This situation created a quiet tension. The captain's actual experience in combat was greater than his official record indicated. The difference was small but consequential. Tour limits were calculated precisely. Crew assignments depended on documented experience levels. A pilot's eligibility for rest, reassignment, or transition to training duties rested on paperwork rather than memory. He raised the issue through appropriate channels, first with his squadron operations officer, then with group headquarters. Each inquiry was met with procedural responses. Forms were submitted. Copies were made. The matter moved upward, slowly. No one suggested impropriety, but no one expedited the correction. Meanwhile, mission schedules were adjusted. The group was tasked with targets farther inland, requiring longer flight times and increased exposure. Crew fatigue became a subject of concern, addressed in memoranda that emphasized discipline and rest cycles. Pilots with fewer credited missions were prioritized for assignment, under the assumption that they needed experience. The captain found himself listed for missions he believed he should no longer be flying, based on his actual sortie. He did not protest loudly. Complaints were discouraged, and he understood the pressures facing commanders. Still, the gap between lived experience and official status widened. He flew additional missions while waiting for earlier credits to be confirmed. Each flight increased his risk without advancing him toward the recognized completion of his tour. By early summer, a new directive arrived from higher command, tightening documentation requirements further. The intent was to standardize reporting across all bomber groups. In practice, it froze several pending cases, including his. Until records were fully reconciled under the new rules, provisional credits were suspended. The captain's role within the unit remained unchanged. He continued to prepare aircraft, brief crews, and execute missions as assigned. Yet a subtle shift occurred. He became more attentive to paperwork, reviewing logs with care, noting discrepancies, and retaining copies of orders. This attention did not alter outcomes, but it reflected an awareness that decisions affecting his service were being made at levels far removed from the airfield. At the same time, operational briefings began to include references to future assignments. Rumors circulated about a major push later in the year. Crews speculated about targets and losses. For those nearing the end of their tours, these discussions carried particular weight. For the captain, the uncertainty was sharper. His position in the system was no longer clear to him. The operational problem, still understated, was becoming evident. The system designed to manage risk and fairness was lagging behind the realities of combat operations. Individual circumstances were absorbed into a process that prioritized uniformity over nuance. The captain was not singled out, but neither was he fully accounted for. As summer approached, his records remained unresolved. He was scheduled for another series of missions, each approved through the same channels that had yet to recognize his earlier work. The airfield continued its routines. Aircraft launched and returned. Losses were recorded. Replacements arrived. The captain prepared as he always had, following procedures, trusting that the system would eventually reconcile itself. There was no confrontation, no dramatic moment. Only a growing awareness that his path was being shaped by decisions and delays beyond his reach. By midsummer 1943, the tempo of operations increased further. Weather windows were narrower, targets were more heavily defended, and the margin for error continued to shrink. Bomber groups were tasked not only with striking industrial sites, but also with testing evolving tactics intended to reduce losses. These changes were developed at higher levels and transmitted downward through directives and briefings, often with limited opportunity for feedback from those flying the missions. At RAF Bassingbourn, the captain's name appeared on mission rosters with increasing frequency. His officially credited experience still placed him below the threshold that would have shifted him into a different rotation. Squadron staff relied on the paperwork in front of them rather than personal recollection. When assignments were made, they were made according to numbers on a board. The discrepancy was raised again, this time with supporting documentation attached. Copies of flight logs, crew statements, and mission orders were assembled. The packet moved through channels already burdened by similar cases. Each level acknowledged receipt. Each level deferred final determination to the next. No one disputed that the missions had occurred. The question was whether they met the revised criteria now in effect. During this period, losses within the group mounted. Aircraft failed to return from deep penetration raids. Crews were reassigned to fill gaps, sometimes with little notice. Training flights were shortened or canceled to free aircraft for operations. The strain showed in maintenance delays and in the tone of briefings, which emphasized adherence to formation and timing above all else. The captain continued to fly under these conditions. His conduct in the air remained consistent. He held position when visibility deteriorated, complied with radio silence, and followed recall orders precisely. His aircraft sustained minor damage on several occasions, flak holes repaired between missions by ground crews working overnight. These incidents were recorded, filed, and moved on from. As weeks passed, the cumulative effect of uncredited missions became more pronounced. Pilots who had arrived after him were rotated out or reassigned based on officially recognized totals. Others transitioned to staff or training roles. The captain remained in the operational pool. This was not presented as punishment or oversight. It was simply the outcome of how records aligned. The tension between reality and doctrine became more visible in briefings. Commanders acknowledged that losses were higher than anticipated, but reiterated that consistency in execution offered the best chance of improvement. Deviations, even when conditions differed from assumptions, were discouraged. The system depended on uniform compliance. Within this framework, the captain's situation was an anomaly that the system was slow to absorb. He was neither inexperienced nor officially complete. His status existed between categories. This ambiguity did not alter expectations placed upon him. He was expected to fly when assigned, to lead his crew effectively, and to accept the risks inherent in each mission. At group headquarters, administrative staff worked to reconcile records under the new directive. The process required cross-referencing mission reports with photographic evidence and intelligence summaries. Delays were compounded by the volume of material and by changes in criteria that were still being interpreted. Cases like the captain's were not prioritized individually. They were processed in batches. Meanwhile, operational planning continued without pause. Targets were selected based on strategic priorities, not on the condition of individual units. When losses occurred, replacement crews filled vacancies. The system absorbed attrition as a statistical factor. Individual trajectories were secondary. The captain became aware that his next assignments would include longer-range missions. These required precise fuel management and extended exposure to enemy defenses. He reviewed procedures carefully and ensured his crew was prepared. There was no indication that his role would change in the near term. By late summer, an internal memo circulated outlining expected mission counts for the coming months. It assumed full availability of crews not yet officially rotated out. Based on his credited total, the captain was included in that pool. The unresolved discrepancy meant that his future was being planned under assumptions that did not reflect his actual experience. He submitted one final inquiry regarding his records, framed carefully and without accusation. The response acknowledged the issue, but cited ongoing review. There was no estimated resolution date. The captain received the message and returned to his duties. The operational problem had now escalated beyond a clerical inconvenience. It influenced assignment decisions, exposure to risk, and the trajectory of his service. Yet it remained invisible in formal terms. On paper, nothing was wrong. The system was functioning as designed, even as it failed to account fully for individual circumstances. As autumn approached, preparations began for a series of major operations planned at higher levels. Briefings referenced coordination across multiple groups and emphasized the importance of maintaining strength. The captain's aircraft was scheduled for inspections and modifications consistent with extended missions. His crew remained intact, though fatigue was evident. There was no confrontation, no refusal, and no deviation from orders. The gap between lived reality and official doctrine widened quietly. Decisions continued to be made far from the airfield, based on summaries and tallies that moved through offices rather than skies. The captain prepared for the missions ahead with the same discipline he had shown throughout the summer. His records remained unresolved, his status unchanged. The consequences of that discrepancy were no longer theoretical, but they had yet to fully manifest. By early autumn 1943, the cumulative effects of the unresolved administrative issue became unavoidable. Operational planning for the bomber force had entered a decisive phase, with missions extending deeper into enemy territory and requiring tighter coordination. The margin for error, already narrow, was shrinking further as German defenses adapted and concentrated around key targets. At RAF Bassingbourn, aircraft modifications reflected this shift. Additional equipment was installed, weight calculations were adjusted, and fuel loads were scrutinized with greater care. Crews attended extended briefings that emphasized timing, formation integrity, and adherence to orders issued well above group level. These orders were framed as necessary responses to strategic imperatives, not open to local interpretation. The captain was assigned as aircraft commander for one such mission profile. On paper, this was consistent with his credited experience. In practice, it placed him in a category that did not fully reflect his actual exposure to combat. He accepted the assignment without comment, focusing instead on preparation. His crew, accustomed to his steady approach, followed established routines. During this period, the captain reached a quiet realization. The administrative process that governed his status was unlikely to resolve itself in time to affect his immediate future. The system was not designed to respond to individual cases quickly, particularly when broader operational demands took precedence. Waiting for formal correction had become impractical. This realization did not lead to overt action or protest. Instead, it altered how he approached his responsibilities. He reviewed mission orders more closely, noting the assumptions embedded in them. He paid particular attention to fuel margins, diversion airfields, and recall procedures. These were not deviations from doctrine, but areas where judgment could be exercised within its boundaries. On one occasion, during a long-range mission briefing, a discrepancy arose between the planned route and recent intelligence reports regarding enemy defenses. The issue was raised briefly, then set aside in favor of maintaining schedule. The captain noted the exchange, but did not pursue it further. The briefing moved on. As missions grew longer and losses continued, informal adjustments began to occur within crews. These were not officially sanctioned changes, but practical responses to conditions encountered repeatedly. Pilots shared observations quietly, comparing notes on flak concentrations and fighter behavior. Such exchanges were cautious, mindful of the emphasis on uniformity. The captain participated in these discussions sparingly. He was aware that unofficial judgments carried risk, both operationally and administratively. Yet he also understood that rigid adherence to assumptions that no longer held could be equally dangerous. Balancing these considerations became part of his role, though it remained unspoken. The turning point came not through a dramatic event, but through accumulation. Another mission credit was delayed, this time due to revised interpretation of bomb release confirmation. The delay meant that even as autumn operations intensified, his official record showed little change. The discrepancy had grown too large to ignore, yet too embedded to resolve quickly. Faced with this reality, the captain adjusted his expectations. He no longer anticipated reassignment or rotation based on paperwork. Instead, he focused on immediate responsibilities, preparing his crew, maintaining discipline, and managing risk within the constraints imposed upon him. This adjustment was internal and pragmatic, not defiant. Risk, however, was becoming personal. Each additional mission carried the same dangers as before, but the prospect of indefinite continuation altered its weight. The captain understood that his exposure was no longer aligned with the system's assumptions. The decisions shaping his service were being made far away, informed by incomplete representations of his experience. Despite this, there was no breakdown in conduct. He continued to fly as ordered, to brief his crew thoroughly, and to execute missions according to plan. Any adjustments he made were subtle, grounded in experience rather than doctrine, and kept within the limits of authority granted to an aircraft commander. As preparations intensified for upcoming operations, the captain's aircraft underwent final inspections. His crew completed their checks and attended briefings that outlined objectives in measured terms. The language was precise, procedural, and detached from individual circumstance. The turning point was complete, though outwardly invisible. The captain had accepted that the system would not account for him fully before events overtook it. His response was not to resist, but to adapt quietly, carrying forward with a clearer understanding of the risks he faced and the limits of the structure guiding him. By late autumn 1943, the consequences of earlier administrative decisions were no longer abstract. They were embedded in the captain's daily responsibilities and in the expectations placed upon him by the system he served. The bomber force was under sustained pressure to maintain operational output, despite losses that exceeded initial projections. Strategic objectives set months earlier were being pursued with limited adjustment, even as conditions evolved. At group level, commanders faced conflicting demands. Higher headquarters emphasized continuity and adherence to established plans, while field reports pointed to mounting fatigue and material strain. These tensions were addressed through memoranda that reinforced discipline and standardized procedure. Individual cases were acknowledged in principle but deferred in practice. The captain's status remained unresolved. His accumulated missions exceeded what his official record reflected, yet assignment decisions continued to rely on the documented totals. As a result, he was scheduled for missions that pilots with comparable actual experience were no longer flying. This outcome was not framed as inequitable. It was treated as a neutral application of policy. Pushback from authority did not take the form of confrontation. It appeared instead as reminders and cautions. When the captain raised operational concerns during briefings, he was reminded of the importance of following approved plans. When he inquired again about his records, he received a response emphasizing patience and trust in the process. The tone was professional, not dismissive, but it reinforced the limits of individual influence. Operational stakes continued to rise. Missions were now coordinated across multiple groups, increasing complexity and reducing flexibility. Weather margins tightened, and recall decisions became more consequential. The captain's aircraft was assigned to formations that required precise timing and extended exposure. These assignments reflected confidence in his abilities, even as they increased his risk. Within his crew, the strain was evident. Long hours, repeated missions, and the absence of clear milestones took their toll. The captain addressed this through routine, clear briefings, consistent expectations, and attention to detail. He did not discuss his administrative situation with them. From their perspective, he was performing his role as required. Authority, however, was increasingly distant. Decisions affecting flight schedules, target selection, and crew rotation were made at levels removed from the airfield. Feedback traveled upward slowly, filtered through layers of reporting. Adjustments, when they occurred, were incremental and generalized. The captain encountered subtle resistance when attempting to exercise discretion within his role. On one mission, he recommended a minor adjustment to formation spacing based on recent experience. The suggestion was noted but not adopted, citing standard operating procedures. On another occasion, he questioned fuel reserve assumptions during planning. The response referenced established calculations and moved on. These moments were not reprimands, but they reinforced boundaries. The system valued uniformity over localized adaptation. Deviations, even cautious ones, were seen as potential sources of inconsistency. The captain adjusted accordingly, limiting his input to required channels. As winter approached, the cumulative exposure weighed more heavily. Losses within the group continued, and replacement crews arrived with limited experience. The captain found himself flying alongside less seasoned pilots, a role that required additional attention during formation and emergencies. This responsibility was informal, not reflected in orders, but it added to his burden. The stakes reached their peak not through a single event, but through convergence. Administrative inertia, operational demands, and doctrinal rigidity combined to place the captain in a position of sustained risk without corresponding recognition or relief. His earlier acceptance of this reality now defined his circumstances. Despite this, there was no breakdown in discipline. The captain continued to comply with orders and to fulfill his duties. His interactions with authority remained professional. Any frustration was contained, expressed only through careful adherence to procedure and quiet diligence. The system, for its part, continued to function according to its design. Records moved through channels, missions were planned and executed, losses were recorded and absorbed. Individual cases like the captain's were not singled out for resolution amid broader priorities. By the end of the year, the operational environment had changed significantly from the one he had entered months earlier. The scale of operations had increased, and the cost was evident. Yet his status remained unchanged, shaped by decisions and delays originating far from the cockpit. The captain prepared for the next phase of operations with the same methodical approach that had defined his service. The consequences of earlier actions were now fully realized, and the stakes could not rise further without altering outcomes. What remained was execution within a system that had little capacity for reconsideration. By the beginning of 1944, the captain's situation had reached its resolution not through correction, but through culmination. The operational environment of the Allied bomber force had shifted again, shaped by preparations for large-scale coordinated campaigns that required sustained pressure rather than episodic strikes. The emphasis was on continuity. Crews still available were used. The captain remained available. His administrative record was finally reviewed as part of a broader audit, ordered by higher headquarters. The review confirmed what had long been informally understood. Several missions flown earlier in the year had not been credited under the criteria then in force, but would have qualified under subsequent interpretations. The finding was noted, annotated, and filed. By the time the correction was entered, it no longer altered any assignment decisions. The correction applied retroactively, without operational effect. There was no ceremony attached to the update. No notification beyond a brief acknowledgement passed down through channels. The captain learned of it indirectly, through a clerk who mentioned that the record now reflected his full tally. By then, the distinction had lost its practical meaning. In the weeks that followed, the captain was assigned to what would be his final operational mission. It was scheduled as part of a routine strike package, not identified as exceptional or decisive. Weather forecasts were marginal but acceptable under standing orders. The target was one among many, supporting broader strategic objectives. Preparation followed standard procedure. Aircraft inspections were completed. Briefings were conducted according to format. The captain reviewed mission details, confirmed crew readiness, and ensured compliance with directives. There was no deviation from established routines. Any personal assessment of risk remained internal. The mission proceeded as planned. Aircraft launched in sequence and formed up over the designated assembly point. En route, conditions deteriorated gradually. Enemy defenses were active but not unexpected. Communications remained disciplined. The captain maintained formation and followed orders as transmitted. What occurred during the latter phase of the mission was recorded in official summaries with restraint. The aircraft encountered concentrated defenses near the target area. Damage was sustained. Systems failures were reported. The aircraft did not return to base. The loss was documented in the same manner as others. Time of last contact was noted. Probable cause was listed within the limits of available information. The crew was recorded as missing, later presumed lost. Notifications were prepared and sent through established channels. Within the unit, the loss was absorbed quickly. Replacement crews were assigned. Aircraft assignments were adjusted. Operations continued. There was no pause beyond what procedure required. In the months that followed, the administrative correction to the captain's record was finalized fully. His mission count was updated to reflect the previously uncredited sorties. The record showed that he had exceeded the standard tour limit before his final assignment. This fact was acknowledged without comment. The system did not revisit earlier decisions. At higher levels, the case did not prompt review of policy. It was one of many instances in which documentation lagged behind operations during a period of rapid expansion and sustained combat. The institutional response was procedural rather than reflective. Processes were refined incrementally, but responsibility remained diffuse. Within historical records, the captain's name appeared only briefly. His service was summarized in tabular form: dates, units, missions flown. The discrepancy that had shaped his experience was not noted. His loss was listed alongside others, without distinction. For his family, the information arrived in stages. Initial notification conveyed uncertainty. Later correspondence confirmed his status. Details were limited, as was customary. There was no reference to administrative matters or to how decisions regarding his service had been made. In the years after the war, official histories emphasized outcomes rather than process. The focus was on strategic results and collective effort. Individual trajectories that diverged from policy assumptions were rarely examined in detail. The captain's experience remained embedded in the larger narrative, indistinguishable from many similar cases. His legacy, such as it was, lay in the routine fulfillment of duty within a system that valued order and consistency above individual variance. He did not challenge that system openly, nor did he seek recognition beyond what was prescribed. His service reflected the conditions under which it occurred, constrained by doctrine, shaped by paperwork, and directed by decisions made far from the cockpit. Today, his story survives primarily through records that capture outcomes without context. The forms are complete, the tallies balanced. The circumstances that led to his final mission are not immediately visible, but they remain implicit in the structure that governed his service. He was one of many pilots whose experience illustrates how large systems operate under strain. His path was not defined by a single error or moment, but by accumulation of delays, assumptions, and procedures applied without adjustment. The result was not unique, but it was specific. In remembering such cases, the emphasis need not be on exception or blame. It is sufficient to acknowledge how ordinary processes can produce extraordinary consequences when distance separates decision from execution. The captain's service ended as it had been conducted, without spectacle, within the rules, and shaped by forces beyond his control.